So finally, we're going to actually articulate our self-image, and later I'll talk about how we can actually put it to use and make effective strategies with it. But now we're gonna go through and we're gonna abstract principles and understandings about the self. And basically, what you're doing is you're analyzing all of this data in order to identify a series of factors. So one of these will be archetypical patterns. And so I've gone through multiple examples of archetypical patterns throughout this course, but one is grandiose goals. That's an archetypical pattern. Vanity goals are also an archetypical pattern. You can go back and look at why that is. I'll tell you why that is, but look at those examples in the context of trying to understand how to identify an archetypical pattern. But essentially, it's being able to see patterns of behavior without the details attached to it, which will provide a lot of insight. And so when these patterns start to reemerge without the same details, right? Maybe you're setting a grandiose goal, and while the goal itself isn't the same, maybe even the resources that you have access to aren't the same, the underlying pattern is still the same, and the same driving forces may be present in both cases. So you can identify this by shuffling through all of that information that you've gathered. And then while you're going through this process of trying to abstract principles, you'll probably want to identify some aspect of the self that you're trying to abstract, and then gear your future data recordings towards that idea, or towards that quality, or towards that principle. So if you're trying to figure out what grandiose goals are, and you notice this pattern where you start off on goals, but you don't get quite the way through them, then in the future, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set a goal. You're going to want to be okay with failing at that goal, and you're going to want to keep track of everything that's related to that goal. So you're going to want to keep track of, go through your day, have your thoughts, and then write down the thoughts that you had that were oriented towards that goal, and create in the bullet journal method, it's called collections. And so you'll create a collection related to that goal. And the factors such as your thoughts, emotions, maybe even the places that you go to work, maybe the habits that you engage on, and when you engage on them in relation to when you work on that goal, are all going to be factors that you're going to want to analyze. And at first, you're going to start dealing with the massively destructive tendencies that cause you to completely fail at the goal, and then eventually you'll start getting to understand factors such as what breakfasts tend to make me more effective versus which ones don't. But you don't want to pay attention to that stuff at first. You want to look at bigger brushstrokes, or which habits are best at keeping me moving towards my goals, or is working out before or after working a better for me? Because I know for some people, if they work out before, they feel more energized and focused, whereas some people tend to feel, more easily, they just prefer to work out after doing the work. I don't understand it. I tend to like to exercise beforehand. It gets me focused. I guess some people feel tired after, and they want to relax after they exercise. So, you're personalizing your strategies. But yeah, archetypical patterns. Start to pay attention, and you can start to see what kind of patterns reemerge in multiple instances with different details. Maybe certain thought patterns, certain action patterns, certain emotional patterns. You're going to start looking at all this information and seeing how it relates to each other. What is the nexus of causality between all of these factors? And sometimes you might want to select or identify one quality factor or pattern, and then pay attention to that over time, and as you search through your existing database, and see how all of the other factors move according to that one that you've chosen as your test variable. So you kind of think about it like you're a scientist investigating this bizarre creature, and that creature is yourself, and you're trying to figure out what makes it tick. With all this information, you start going down a lot of rabbit holes, especially with psychology. If you want to look at the Jungian archetypes, or Carl Jung's archetypes, you could start to abstract qualities of what's called your shadow, or your anima/animus, or your persona, or yourself, which they have all their archetypical implications, and that could be a whole other course on its own. So we won't look at that, but if you're curious, that can be extremely useful to understanding how your subconscious influences the actions that you take. And then having a database of information about yourself gives you a lot of information to look at to abstract those qualities. So another couple of things that you're gonna abstract are going to be, well, the first is going to be your articulated versus your acted out mindsets. And so I already kind of alluded to this. Sometimes we'll tell ourselves that we should approach life with this mindset, and then as we go through our day, we'll see that certain events happen, and see how our actions, what kind of actions we take after that event, and then that will be more or less representative of our acting out that mindset that we claim to want to implement. So one example of this is, say you want to be more forgiving, but you notice that you're going through your day and you get all of a sudden you're really pissed, and then you just spend the rest of the day really pissed. And what happened was somebody cut you off, and that just really put a real damper on your day, and you're just angry after that. Well, it's not very representative of a forgiving mindset, because if you were forgiving, you wouldn't be angry and salty all day. Another thing is that you can start to discover what your beliefs are, or as well as see what beliefs are driving what actions. So our beliefs that we hold most dear are the beliefs that are going to drive the way that we act. We act out what we believe. Not so much what we rationally think, but what we believe and have, that emotional attachment to. So, kind of like the case with mindsets, we can look at our actions and see what beliefs are reflected in them, and we can look at the thoughts that arise around the times of those actions. So I think one that's really, really worth looking into, and I think is true of a lot of people, is the belief in determinism. And I don't think people realize how much of a hindrance the belief in determinism has. Now, metaphysically, whether we are determined or not doesn't really matter and can't really be proven one way or the other. But most people who have a genuine belief in free will and are willing to kind of stand by it, even when it's put under some scrutiny, tend to have much higher levels of willpower, or at least seem to be more capable of acting in accordance with their long-term goals and values. And those who tend to be more deterministic tend to be, leaves blowing in the wind, if you will, and much more susceptible to being reactionary. I don't know if that's actually a word, reactionary. Tend to be more prone to reaction than to reason, even though they claim to be the most rational of us all. And, there's a whole pride that goes into that perspective. Sometimes, not all the time. But this is a line of thinking that I noticed, which was when I started to get discouraged, or I started to face difficulty, or even when I was being successful and I attributed that success to determinism, I would find that my productivity and my ability to take the actions that I wanted to take would decline. And I think a big part of this is that when you have those deterministic thoughts and ideas, or that deterministic belief manifests itself in your thoughts in regards to the actions that you're taking, it's easy to forget about the intentional energy that needs to be tapped into in order to take the actions that you want to take. So, for example, waking up in the morning, you want to wake up at sunrise every day, let's say. That takes a substantial amount of internal determination, is what it feels like. Now, metaphysically, it may or may not be that, but when you're making these hard choices, there's this feeling of internal activation that takes place that causes that subsequent action to happen. And there's a difference between that and running on autopilot. And autopilot can be productive or can be unproductive. Autopilot for some people is yelling at their neighbor, freaking jacking off in the street, and then, watching TV and eating freaking potato chips all day. Other people, their autopilot is wake up at 6 a.m., go for a run, then, eat a healthy breakfast, do all this stuff, get all this stuff done. Either way, it's autopilot. And in both cases, in order to undetermine yourself, there are always going to be certain actions that are required to take, that require this initiative. And I think that the deterministic outlook forgets that really easily and really quickly. And that's something I noticed in myself. I was running on autopilot, or I wasn't even really running on autopilot in a positive direction. I was willing myself to be productive, and I would get good streaks of this going, and I would start thinking that it was, in a sense, determined, or there was these subtle deterministic thoughts that would arise in relation to my thinking about the actions that I was taking. It was all happening very subtly. And then, as a result of that, my subsequent actions would deflate or become less effective, less motivated. I myself would become less motivated. In a sense, I would forget the internal will that was necessary to continue acting in the way that I wanted to act. So that's important to keep in mind. And that's a belief that you can notice is driving your actions. And there are many more out there. I don't have too many other examples that I could really give, but going through this process will help you discover a lot of belief-driven actions, and then understand those beliefs, and then find area to maneuver them. And so to some degree, my thinking on determinism has switched to a leap of faith argument that I believe on faith that we have free will, simply because it is more practical to believe that, and it is much more useful, and my life as a whole is directed more intentionally when I hold that belief true. And when I see deterministic thoughts arise, I say, no, I just don't believe that. That's just bullshit. And in some sense, you could argue that it's not the most rational thing, but the reality is that rationality has its limits, and we need to be able to act the way that we want to act in the present, not in some rational utopia. So deal with your beliefs. Figure out what your beliefs are and what beliefs are most impactful on the actions that you don't want to take, and which beliefs are most impactful on the ones that you do want to take, and manipulate them in accordance with what's going to help you to live, your most fulfilling life, and the life that's going to cause you to be the best influence that you can be on the people around you. Another, you call it quality of the self, that we're going to want to derive throughout this process are your true values versus your articulated values. I read about this recently. I wanted to readdress it, but I cannot remember what I read this from. But it was a really interesting idea. And basically, it's the idea that what you say you value, what you say you see as good or bad, or what you see as worthwhile uses of your time or not, are different than what your true values are. It might have been in Designing the Mind. That was a pretty interesting book. Another one I would definitely recommend if you're interested in the whole cognitive triangle and a lot of the more psychological factors that we've discussed, especially in regards to rationality. Designing the Mind is a great one. But so you're going to have a difference between your stated values and your, I think I said articulated. Let's call them stated values to not overuse the same word. So your stated values and your genuine values. And so through experience throughout our life, we develop genuine values, and we can choose not to act out these values because it's easier. Doing so can cause us to say that we value other things than those actual values, or not acknowledge the fact that we have those values. And what happens here often is there's a disconnect between the true self and the self-image, of course. And there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs. And so part of that is when we don't act out our genuine values and we act out opposing values. And the difference between this and beliefs is that beliefs drive our actions. Action is a result of our beliefs. The difference here, in the context that I'm using it, is that our values aren't driving our actions. We want our actions to reflect our values, but that's not always the case. In both cases, we can be blind to the genuinely held belief or value. Doing this process is going to help us abstract what our genuine beliefs and genuine values are. We can look at our beliefs by seeing what's reflected in our actions, but when our actions don't align with what we value, there's an internal cognitive dissonance that occurs, and a lot of times in order to cover that up, as it gets more and more intense, we'll go towards distractions. So a lot of productivity discussions don't really address, I think, what are a lot of the root causes of, for example, procrastination. And I think a huge problem with procrastination is people hold certain values and then they don't act those values out because it's easy, and then they don't want to recognize it, and because of that discomfort, they seek distraction. And as that progresses, they may seek drug use and alcohol. And then as that progresses, it can grow into addictions. And so social media addiction is to a degree a part of this, because when you're doing work, those thoughts, maybe not the clear thoughts, but the quieter thoughts, as well as the associated emotions, will start to arise, and we'll start to feel uncomfortable, and we'll be doing something productive, but we start to feel uncomfortable. Although there are also the cases where if you're able to invest yourself and focus on your work, you're able to distract yourself with your work, and that's where workaholism comes from. And so in a sense, this is something that's going to make it harder to have some balance in life, or do the things that are less stimulating, because once you're a workaholic, generally it's because you've learned enough for your work to be stimulating enough to push other things out of your mind. And that's essentially what's happening there. Anyway, that was just a little tangent. But you're gonna want to figure out what your genuine values are, and you're gonna do that by looking at your life experiences and look at what it taught you, and then look at your current actions and see how that's reflected. Again, the mindset of being more forgiving, or just the value of you value forgiveness and not acting that out, holding grudges, for example, is not representative of that value. And holding that value, again, it's not necessarily something that's rationally derived. In a lot of cases, it's something that's experimentally instilled. So you go through life and you have experiences where you're really pissed off at somebody, but then you choose to forgive them, and then you talk about it with them, and then because you've already forgiven them for it, the discussion goes well, and you're like, great, now I value forgiveness. But then on top of that, later, perhaps let's say you don't forgive them, you have another issue, you don't forgive them, you grow resentful towards them, you don't address it, and then it bubbles up into a big ass issue that further justifies that value, but it also creates that internal dissonance, which can cause you to cause you to either realize that you're not acting in accordance with your values, which is now more justified, or you can repress that and then get that internal conflict going. So you wanna be able to figure out what your genuine values are and aren't. And then finally, at the root of all of this are those freaking driving forces. You want to look for those. Generally, they're either thoughts or they're emotions behind the actions.